The champagne glass trembled in my hand as I stared at the seating chart, my name scrawled in hurried handwriting at the very bottom of the list. Table 12. Outside on the patio. Away from the family tables, away from the wedding party, tucked behind a pillar where the evening breeze would chill my shoulders and the string quartet would sound like a distant memory. My brother's wedding day, and I'd been relegated to dining with his college roommates plus ones and distant cousins nobody had spoken to in years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 22 years of military service, 3 tours overseas, a bronze star gathering dust on my apartment mantel, and this is where I belonged in my own family's eyes. Not at table 1 with my parents and grandparents, not even at table 5 with the extended family. Table 12. The overflow table. The afterthought table. My name is Colonel Rachele Matthews, though most people just call me Ray. I'm 39 years old, never married, no children, and I've spent more than half my adult life serving my country in places most people can't pronounce. I've commanded 300 soldiers, managed multi-million-dollar operations, and been trusted with classified information that could change the course of international relations. But standing in the elegant ballroom of the Riverside Country Club in Richmond, Virginia, staring at that seating chart with its gold calligraphy and delicate rose borders, I felt smaller than I had since I was 8 years old, and my little brother Tommy got the bigger slice of birthday cake. Tommy wasn't little anymore, of course. At 35, he towered over my 5'6" frame, all broad shoulders and easy charm, the golden boy who'd never left Richmond, never left the comfortable bubble of our parents' expectations. He was marrying Sarah, a sweet kindergarten teacher with honey-colored hair and a laugh that sounded like wind chimes. They'd met at a charity auction 2 years ago, fell in love over shared interests in weekend brunches and home renovation shows, and planned a wedding that looked like it belonged in Southern Living magazine. I should have been happy for him. I was happy for him. But happiness and hurt aren't mutually exclusive, and right now the hurt was winning. The country club buzzed with pre-ceremony activity. Women in pastel dresses floated between the gift table and the bar, their voices rising and falling in that particular rhythm of polite small talk. Men adjusted their ties and checked their watches, already calculating how long they'd need to stay before sneaking off to catch the game. Children in miniature formal wear raced between chair legs, while their mothers hissed gentle warnings about grass stains and torn hems. I smoothed the fabric of my navy dress, the one I'd bought specifically for this occasion during a rare afternoon off in D.C. last month. It was more expensive than anything hanging in my closet, conservative enough for a church wedding but elegant enough to show I'd made an effort. The saleswoman had assured me it was perfect for a special family occasion. She hadn't mentioned it would be perfect for sitting alone on a patio while my family celebrated without me. Sarah's mother, Mrs. Patricia Cunningham, swept past me in a cloud of expensive perfume and nervous energy. She wore blush pink silk that probably cost more than my monthly car payment, and her graying hair was twisted into an elaborate updo that had clearly required professional intervention. She glanced at me briefly, offered a tight smile that never reached her eyes, and continued her inspection of the flower arrangements. We'd met exactly 3 times before today. Once at Tommy's birthday dinner last year, once at Christmas, and once at their engagement party 6 months ago. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Each time, she'd asked the same polite questions about my military service, nodded at the appropriate moments, and then quickly redirected the conversation to safer topics like wedding planning or the weather. I wasn't sure if she disapproved of my career choice or simply didn't know what to do with a woman who carried a sidearm more often than a purse. My mother appeared at my elbow, resplendent in emerald green, with matching earrings that had been a Christmas gift from my father decades ago. At 62, she was still beautiful, though worry lines had deepened around her eyes in recent years. She'd spent the last 6 months throwing herself into wedding preparations with the intensity of a general planning a military campaign, and today was her moment of triumph. "Rachele, honey, you look lovely," she said, adjusting an invisible speck of lint on my shoulder. "I'm so glad you could get leave for this." "Tommy was worried you might not make it." I'd requested leave 3 months in advance and confirmed my attendance twice, but I didn't mention that. Instead, I smiled and said, "Wouldn't miss it, Mom. Everything looks beautiful." And it did. The country club's main ballroom had been transformed into a garden paradise, with white roses and ivy cascading from every surface. Crystal chandeliers caught the late afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows, casting rainbow prisms across walls draped in champagne-colored silk. The cake tables showcased a 5-tier masterpiece decorated with sugar flowers that looked more real than the living roses in the centerpieces. "I know the seating arrangement might seem a little strange," my mother continued, her voice dropping to that particular tone mothers use when they're about to explain something they know you won't like. "But Sarah's family has so many relatives, and we wanted to make sure everyone had a good time. You know how these things are." I knew exactly how these things were. Sarah's side of the family filled 8 tables. Aunts and uncles and cousins and family friends, all clustered together in the prime real estate near the dance floor and the head table. My family filled 4 tables, and apparently I didn't rank high enough to sit with any of them. "Of course," I said, keeping my voice level. "I understand completely." My mother's relief was palpable. She squeezed my arm and hurried off to check on some other crisis, leaving me alone with my thoughts and my champagne. I found myself studying the other guests at my assigned table. There was Derek, Tommy's college roommate, who I'd met maybe twice in the past decade, accompanied by a woman whose name I'd already forgotten. An elderly couple who appeared to be neighbors of the Cunninghams, based on their conversation about property taxes and lawn care services. 2 20-something cousins from Sarah's side who kept taking selfies and seemed more interested in their Instagram stories than the wedding festivities. This was my peer group, apparently. The miscellaneous category. The people who didn't quite fit anywhere else but couldn't be left off the guest list entirely. I excused myself and walked out to the patio where table 12 waited. The space was lovely, I had to admit. Overlooking the club's golf course with the James River visible in the distance, framed by towering oak trees that had probably stood here since before the Civil War. White lights had been strung between the branches, and heaters positioned strategically to ward off the October chill. Under different circumstances, I might have appreciated the romantic ambiance. But these weren't different circumstances, and romance was the last thing on my mind. I checked my phone, more out of habit than necessity. No urgent messages from my unit, no crisis requiring my immediate attention. For the first time in months, I was completely off duty, free to focus on personal matters. The irony wasn't lost on me that the personal matter at hand was feeling like a stranger at my own brother's wedding. A server in a crisp black uniform approached with a tray of hors d'oeuvres. Bacon-wrapped scallops, miniature crab cakes, some kind of filo pastry that probably had a French name I couldn't pronounce. I took a crab cake and thanked him, grateful for something to do with my hands besides grip my champagne glass like it was a lifeline. The ceremony would start in 30 minutes. After that, cocktail hour on the terrace, followed by dinner and dancing until midnight. I'd blocked out the entire weekend for this celebration, turned down 2 other invitations, and rearranged my schedule to be here. The hotel room I'd booked was costing me $200 a night, and I'd spent another $300 on wedding gifts from their registry. The navy dress had been $200 more, plus another $100 for shoes and accessories that I'd probably never wear again. But the real cost wasn't financial. The real cost was sitting here on this patio, watching my family celebrate the most important day in my brother's life, and realizing that I'd somehow become an outsider to the people who were supposed to love me most. Growing up, Tommy and I had been inseparable. He was 4 years younger, which made me the protective big sister who taught him how to throw a curveball and helped him with his math homework. When he broke his arm falling out of the old maple tree in our backyard, I was the one who carried him inside and stayed with him at the hospital until our parents arrived. When he got his heart broken by his first girlfriend, I was the one who brought him ice cream and listened to him cry. Somewhere along the way, though, we drifted apart. Not dramatically, not with any particular incident or falling out. Just the gradual erosion that happens when 2 people choose very different paths in life. He went to Virginia Tech and studied business, joined a fraternity, spent his weekends at football games and parties. I went to VMI and studied international relations, spent my weekends in the library or running training exercises in the mountains. After college, he moved back to Richmond and took a job at a regional bank. I went to officer candidate school and then to my first posting in Georgia. He dated regularly, always someone sweet and conventional who fit seamlessly into the social circles our parents moved in. I dated sporadically, usually fellow officers who understood the demands of military life but rarely stayed in one place long enough for anything serious to develop. He bought a house 3 miles from where we grew up, close enough for Sunday dinners and impromptu visits. I lived wherever the Army sent me, collecting addresses like postcards and never staying long enough to feel truly at home anywhere. He coached Little League and volunteered at the food bank and became the kind of pillar of the community's son that made our parents beam with pride at dinner parties. I served in Iraq and Afghanistan, earned commendations and promotions, led soldiers through dangerous missions and brought them home safely. But somehow, in our family's eyes, his accomplishments always seemed to shine brighter than mine. Maybe it was because his life was easier to understand. Banking and mortgages and weekend golf games were concepts that made sense to our parents' generation. Military strategy and counterinsurgency operations and the complexities of modern warfare were foreign territories that required explanations they didn't always want to hear. Or maybe it was simply that he was here, physically present for birthdays and holidays and family emergencies, while I was always somewhere else, connected by phone calls and video chats and promises to visit when my schedule allowed. The sound of string music drifted from the main ballroom as the quartet began their prelude. Guests started filtering toward the ceremony space, a garden area behind the country club where white chairs had been arranged in perfect rows, facing an altar decorated with more roses than I'd ever seen in one place. I finished my champagne and followed the crowd, taking my assigned seat in the third row, behind Sarah's great aunts and in front of Tommy's former coworkers. My parents sat in the front row, my father distinguished in his charcoal gray suit and silver tie, my mother dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief even though nothing sad had happened yet. Sarah's parents occupied the opposite side, surrounded by what appeared to be half the population of Richmond's country club set. I recognized a few faces from local news coverage, a judge, a city councilman, the owner of a chain of successful restaurants. These were Sarah's people, the social and professional network she'd grown up in, and that Tommy had eagerly joined. They played tennis together and attended charity galas, and took couples trips to Hilton Head and the Hamptons. They belonged to the same clubs, shopped at the same stores, and sent their children to the same private schools their parents had attended. I didn't begrudge Tommy his happiness or his success. He'd worked hard at the bank, earned promotions and respect, built a comfortable life that suited his personality perfectly. Sarah was genuinely sweet, the kind of woman who remembered your birthday and sent handwritten thank you notes, and probably never had an unkind thought about anyone. But sitting there in my expensive dress that didn't feel quite right, surrounded by people who knew each other's children's names and vacation plans, I felt like an anthropologist observing a foreign culture. This world of social expectations and unspoken rules, of knowing the right people and saying the right things, was as alien to me as the mountain villages of Afghanistan had once been. The processional began with Sarah's bridesmaids, 5 women in dusty rose gowns who looked like they'd stepped out of a bridal magazine. They moved in perfect synchronization, their bouquets held at exactly the same angle, their smiles bright and practiced. Tommy's groomsmen followed, all of them clean-cut young men in navy suits who could have been brothers themselves. They took their positions at the altar with military precision that would have made my drill sergeant proud. Tommy appeared next, escorted by our father, and despite everything, my heart swelled with pride. He looked handsome and happy and nervous, in the best possible way, the kind of nervous that comes from standing on the threshold of everything you've ever wanted. When he reached the altar and turned to face the congregation, his eyes found mine for just a moment, and he offered a small, grateful smile that reminded me of the little boy who used to hold my hand during thunderstorms. Then came Sarah, radiant in ivory silk and her grandmother's pearls, walking slowly down the rose-petal-scattered aisle on her father's arm. She was everything a bride should be, glowing with happiness and love and the confidence that comes from knowing you're surrounded by everyone who matters most in your life. When she reached Tommy and took his hands, the expression on his face was so tender and full of love that I had to blink back unexpected tears. The ceremony itself was beautiful and traditional, full of scripture readings and classical music and vows that they'd written themselves. Tommy promised to love and cherish Sarah, to support her dreams and share her burdens, to be her partner and best friend for all the days of their lives. Sarah promised to stand by Tommy through whatever challenges they might face, to build a home filled with laughter and love, to grow old with him and never stop believing in their future together. I meant every word of the congratulations I offered during the receiving line, hugging them both tightly and telling them how beautiful the ceremony had been. Because it was true. Love is love, regardless of seating arrangements or social dynamics, and what I'd witnessed between my brother and his new wife was real and powerful and worth celebrating. But as I made my way back to the patio for cocktail hour, the hurt settled back into my chest, like a familiar weight. The ceremony had been a brief respite from feeling like an outsider, a moment when I could focus on Tommy's happiness instead of my own displaced feelings. Now, watching the other guests cluster together in animated conversation while I stood alone by the railing, overlooking the golf course, the isolation returned with renewed force. I was 39 years old, successful in my career, respected by my peers, trusted with responsibilities that most people couldn't imagine. I'd survived combat zones and natural disasters, led teams through crises, and made split-second decisions that saved lives. But here, in this elegant country club surrounded by my own family, I felt as lost and uncertain as I had on my first day of basic training. The irony was that tomorrow, I'd return to a world where I was Colonel Matthews, where soldiers snapped to attention when I walked into a room and my opinion carried weight in discussions that affected national security. But tonight I was just Tommy's sister, the one who lived too far away and didn't quite fit in, relegated to table 12, where she wouldn't disturb the real family celebration. The sun was beginning to set over the James River, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that would have been perfect for wedding photos. Guests moved between the patio and the main ballroom, their voices creating a pleasant hum of celebration that should have made me feel included but somehow only emphasized how separate I felt from it all. Tomorrow, I promised myself I would start to figure out how to bridge the gap that had grown between me and the family I'd spent 22 years serving my country to protect. But tonight, I would endure table 12 and smile at the appropriate moments and pretend that being an afterthought at my own brother's wedding didn't break my heart just a little bit. What I didn't know, as I stood there watching the sunset and trying to summon the energy for several more hours of polite small talk, was that everything was about to change in ways I never could have imagined. The reception began with all the fanfare you'd expect from a wedding that had been planned for 8 months and cost more than most people's annual salary. I made my way to table 12 as the other guests filtered into the ballroom, their voices creating that particular symphony of celebration that comes with open bars and reunited families. The centerpiece at my table was stunning, I had to admit, with white hydrangeas and trailing ivy arranged around pillar candles that cast a warm glow across the ivory linens. Derek, Tommy's college roommate, was already seated with his date, a petite brunette named Jennifer, who worked in marketing for a tech startup. The elderly neighbors, Harold and Marge Peterson, were discussing the wine selection with the authority of people who had attended enough country club events to have strong opinions about vintages. Sarah's young cousins had been reassigned to a different table, leaving their seats empty and making our group feel even smaller and more disconnected from the main celebration. I settled into my chair and tried to project an air of contentment, the way I'd learned to do during countless military functions where maintaining composure was more important than actual happiness. The skill had served me well over the years, though I'd never imagined I'd need to deploy it at my own brother's wedding. The evening began to unfold with the predictable rhythm of formal celebrations. Tommy and Sarah made their grand entrance to thunderous applause, their faces glowing with the kind of joy that makes everyone else want to fall in love. Their first dance was to "The Way You Look Tonight," and watching them move together with such natural grace and obvious affection, I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Not jealousy, exactly, but a recognition of something beautiful that I'd never experienced myself. During the salad course, I found myself studying the other tables with the same analytical attention I'd once applied to reconnaissance missions. Table 1 held my parents and Sarah's parents, along with both sets of grandparents and a few distinguished older relatives. They were deep in conversation about something that kept making my father nod approvingly while Sarah's father gestured expansively with his wine glass. Table 2 was the wedding party, all young and attractive and animated by the special energy that comes with being chosen to stand beside the bride and groom on their most important day. I recognized most of Tommy's groomsmen from various family gatherings over the years, though I'd never spent enough time with any of them to develop real relationships. They were good guys, the kind who showed up when you needed help moving furniture and remembered your birthday without being reminded. Tables 3 through 6 held Sarah's extended family, a collection of aunts and uncles and cousins who all seemed to know each other's children's names and college majors and career aspirations. Their conversations flowed effortlessly, from shared memories to future plans, the kind of easy intimacy that comes from growing up in the same social circle and never really leaving it. My own family was scattered across tables 7 and 8, though the term scattered was perhaps more accurate than I wanted to admit. My father's sister Helen was there with her husband Robert and their twin daughters, both now in their 20s and working in D.C. My mother's brother Charles had driven down from Maryland with his wife Patricia and their teenage son. A handful of family friends who had known Tommy and me since we were children filled out the remaining seats. What struck me as I watched them interact was how naturally they seemed to fit into this environment, how comfortable they appeared with the country club atmosphere and formal service and elaborate floral arrangements. When had that happened? When had my family become the kind of people who belonged at events like this, while I had somehow remained frozen in time as the girl who preferred hiking boots to high heels and field rations to 5-course meals? The answer, I realized, wasn't that they had changed so much as that I had missed the gradual evolution. While I was learning to navigate foreign cultures and master military protocol and build relationships with fellow officers who understood the demands of service life, my family had been growing and changing and adapting to new circumstances without me there to witness the process. My cousin Lisa, Helen's daughter, worked for a consulting firm that specialized in government contracts. She'd started there straight out of college and had worked her way up to senior analyst, developing expertise in areas that actually overlapped with some of my military experience. But we'd never had a real conversation about it, never compared notes or shared insights that might have bridged the gap between our very different professional worlds. My Uncle Charles had retired from his job as a high school principal 2 years ago and had thrown himself into volunteer work with veterans organizations. He'd spent countless hours at the VA hospital, helping former soldiers navigate the bureaucracy of benefits and medical care. Here was a family member who understood something about military life and its challenges, who might have appreciated the complexities of what I did for a living, and I'd somehow never connected with him about it. The pattern repeated itself as I surveyed the room. Sarah's uncle was a federal judge who had spent years working on cases involving military contractors and defense spending. Her cousin worked for the State Department, frequently traveling to regions where I'd served. There were connections and common ground everywhere I looked, relationships that might have flourished if I'd been present enough to nurture them. But instead, I'd spent the last 2 decades building my identity around being the family member who was always somewhere else, always focused on duties and responsibilities that took me away from birthday parties and graduations and quiet Sunday dinners where real relationships are built. I'd told myself that my service was more important, that protecting my family and my country justified the sacrifices and the distance. Now I was beginning to wonder if I'd used duty as an excuse to avoid the harder work of staying emotionally connected to the people who mattered most. The main course arrived with the efficiency of a well-orchestrated military operation. Servers in crisp uniforms moved between tables with synchronized precision, delivering plates of herb-crusted salmon or beef tenderloin with seasonal vegetables arranged like small works of art. The Petersons struck up a conversation with Derek about their grandson's college search, while Jennifer shared stories about her company's latest marketing campaign for a fitness app that claimed to revolutionize how people approached exercise. I found myself playing the role of interested observer, asking polite questions and making appropriate comments while my mind continued to wander through the evening's revelations. How many family gatherings had I missed over the years? How many opportunities to deepen relationships and build the kind of bonds that would have made tonight feel like a celebration instead of an exile? The math was sobering. 3 deployments overseas had cost me roughly 4 years of family time. Add in the months of training before and after each deployment, the temporary assignments to different bases, the schools and conferences and exercises that were essential for career advancement, and I'd probably spent less than half of the last 2 decades actually living in the same country as my family, much less the same state or city. During my second tour in Afghanistan, I'd missed my grandmother's funeral because I couldn't get emergency leave approved in time. I'd participated in the memorial service via video call from a base computer, watching my family grieve together while I sat alone in a trailer half a world away. At the time, I told myself that my grandmother would have understood, that she'd raised 3 sons during World War II and knew something about the sacrifices that military families make. But looking back now, I wondered if understanding and accepting were the same thing. Maybe my family had learned to work around my absence not because they preferred it that way, but because they'd had to. Maybe the gradual drift wasn't about them growing apart from me, but about them learning to function as a unit that didn't include me at its center. The thought was more painful than I wanted to admit. I'd built my entire adult identity around being the responsible one, the protector, the family member who served something larger than herself. If that service had actually cost me my place in the family I was trying to protect, what did that say about the choices I'd made and the priorities I'd embraced? As if summoned by my brooding thoughts, my mother appeared beside my chair, elegant in her emerald dress and carefully applied makeup. She placed a gentle hand on my shoulder and leaned down to speak softly in my ear, her voice carrying the particular tone she'd used when I was young, and she was trying to comfort me after a disappointment. "How are you doing, sweetheart? I know this seating arrangement isn't ideal, but I hope you're enjoying yourself." I looked up at her, this woman who had raised me and worried about me and celebrated my achievements even when she didn't fully understand them, and tried to find words that would bridge the growing gap between what I was feeling and what I thought she wanted to hear. "I'm fine, Mom. Really, the food is wonderful, and everyone at the table is very nice." She studied my face with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 39 years reading my moods and motivations. "You seem a little quiet tonight, not that there's anything wrong with that, of course. Big family gatherings can be overwhelming." Overwhelming. The word hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that neither of us wanted to explore too deeply. Was I overwhelmed by the social dynamics, by the realization that I'd become a stranger at my own family's celebration? Or was she overwhelmed by trying to figure out how to include a daughter whose life had diverged so dramatically from everyone else's that she no longer fit easily into family gatherings? "I suppose I'm just tired," I said, offering her the excuse she seemed to want. "It's been a busy few months, and I'm not used to events like this anymore." My mother's expression softened with relief and something that might have been pity. "Of course you're tired. You work so hard, Rachele. Always have, even when you were little. I used to worry that you pushed yourself too much, that you didn't know how to just relax and enjoy life." There it was, the gentle criticism wrapped in maternal concern that had followed me since childhood. The suggestion that my drive and ambition were somehow excessive, that my commitment to excellence was a character flaw rather than a strength. I'd heard variations of this theme countless times over the years, usually delivered with love, but tinged with the implication that my choices were somehow misguided or extreme. "Military life requires a certain level of commitment," I said carefully, trying to keep defensiveness out of my voice. "But I do know how to relax. I just haven't had much opportunity lately." "I know you do, honey, and we're all so proud of what you've accomplished. Your father still brags about your promotion to every person he meets. It's just that sometimes I wonder if you're missing out on other things. Important things." The unspoken subtext was clear. Marriage, children, the conventional markers of female success that my mother's generation still valued above professional achievement. She'd never said it directly, but I could feel her worry about my single status, her concern that my military career had somehow cost me the chance at the kind of happiness Tommy had found with Sarah. What she didn't understand, what I'd never been able to explain in a way that made sense to her, was that I hadn't sacrificed those things for my career. I'd simply discovered that the life she envisioned for me didn't fit the person I'd become. The men I'd dated over the years had been intelligent and accomplished and attractive, but none of them had inspired the kind of deep connection that would have made me want to rearrange my entire existence around building a life together. Maybe that made me selfish or unrealistic or damaged in some fundamental way. Maybe I'd become too independent, too set in my ways, too comfortable with solitude to ever truly merge my life with someone else's. Or maybe I just hadn't met the right person yet, someone who could match my intensity and ambition and understand that my work wasn't just a job, but a calling. "I'm not missing out on anything, Mom," I said, reaching up to squeeze her hand. "I have a good life. Different from what you might have envisioned for me, but good." She smiled and kissed the top of my head, the same gesture she'd used to comfort me when I was small and had skinned my knee or been disappointed by a friend's betrayal. "I know you do, sweetheart. And I'm proud of you, you know that, right? We all are." After she returned to her table, I sat quietly for a moment, processing the conversation and its underlying meanings. This was the crux of the problem, I realized. My family loved me and supported me and wanted me to be happy, but they didn't really understand the person I'd become or the life I'd chosen. And because they didn't understand, they couldn't quite figure out how to include me in their world without constantly highlighting the ways I didn't fit. The band began to play, and couples started moving toward the dance floor. Tommy and Sarah led the way, still glowing with newlywed happiness as they swayed together to a slow song that I didn't recognize, but that obviously held special meaning for them. Other couples joined them gradually, parents and grandparents and wedding party members, until the dance floor was filled with people moving together in the timeless rhythm of celebration. I watched Derek and Jennifer join the dancers, her head resting on his shoulder as they moved together with the easy intimacy of a couple who'd been together long enough to anticipate each other's movements. The Petersons sat out this dance but were clearly enjoying watching the younger generation celebrate, their faces soft with the kind of contentment that comes from witnessing joy in others. At tables throughout the ballroom, I could see similar scenes playing out. Families gathered together, multiple generations sharing stories and laughter, and the comfortable closeness that comes from years of shared experience. This was what normal looked like, I realized. This was the life that most people built for themselves. The network of relationships and traditions and ongoing connections that created a sense of belonging and continuity. I'd chosen a different path, one that had brought its own rewards and satisfactions. I'd seen parts of the world that most people only read about in newspapers, worked with individuals whose courage and dedication had inspired me daily, and contributed to something larger and more important than my own personal happiness. Those weren't small accomplishments, and I didn't regret the choices that had led me to them. But sitting alone at table 12 while my family celebrated around me, I couldn't ignore the cost of those choices anymore. I'd gained expertise and experience and a sense of purpose that fulfilled me professionally, but I'd lost something equally valuable in the process. I'd lost the deep, ongoing connections that create a sense of home and belonging, the relationships that sustain people through both triumph and tragedy. The recognition wasn't entirely new. I'd felt hints of it during quiet moments over the years, usually late at night in temporary quarters when the isolation felt particularly acute. But I'd always been able to push those feelings aside by focusing on the mission at hand, by reminding myself that my work was important, and that personal sacrifices were part of the bargain I'd made when I chose military service. Tonight, however, the feelings refused to be pushed aside. Tonight, surrounded by my family but feeling completely separate from them, I had to acknowledge that something fundamental was missing from my life. Not romance necessarily, though that would have been nice, but connection, community, the sense of being truly known and valued by people who mattered. The irony was that I'd spent my entire career building and maintaining relationships with fellow officers and soldiers, creating bonds of trust and loyalty that had sustained me through some of the most challenging experiences of my life. Military friendships were intense and meaningful, forged under pressure and tested by circumstances that revealed people's true character. I'd served with individuals I would trust with my life, people whose integrity and competence I respected without reservation. But those relationships, however deep and important, were also temporary. Military life meant constant movement, new assignments, changing units, and the gradual drift that inevitably occurred when people's paths diverged. I'd lost touch with dozens of friends and colleagues over the years, not through any lack of affection or respect, but simply because maintaining long-distance relationships required more time and energy than any of us could consistently invest. The result was that I'd become very good at forming intense but ultimately temporary connections, while becoming increasingly distant from the permanent relationships that might have anchored my life in more lasting ways. I could lead soldiers through combat and build trust with foreign officials, and navigate complex interpersonal dynamics in high-stress situations, but I couldn't figure out how to stay close to my own family or build the kind of enduring friendships that sustained most people through the ups and downs of adult life. As the evening progressed and the celebration continued around me, I found myself conducting a mental inventory of my current relationships. There were colleagues I respected and enjoyed working with, but our friendships were mostly confined to professional settings. There were neighbors in my current apartment complex who were pleasant and cordial, but with whom I'd never progressed beyond polite small talk. There were acquaintances from the gym and the grocery store and the coffee shop I frequented, people whose faces I recognized and whose basic life details I knew but who wouldn't have called me in a crisis, or invited me to spend holidays with their families. The picture that emerged wasn't flattering. At 39, I'd become someone who was professionally successful and personally isolated, competent at my job but struggling to maintain meaningful connections outside of work. I'd told myself that this was a temporary situation, that I'd have time to build real relationships once I retired from military service and could stay in one place long enough to put down roots. But looking around the ballroom at my family's celebration, I realized that building lasting relationships wasn't something you could postpone indefinitely. The bonds that sustained people through life's challenges were created through consistent presence and shared experiences, and the gradual accumulation of trust and understanding that came from being there for each other through both ordinary moments and extraordinary ones. Tommy had that with Sarah now, and with the friends who had chosen him as their best man, and with the colleagues who had become close enough to be invited to his wedding. My parents had it with each other, and with the network of friends they'd cultivated over decades of community involvement. Even Sarah's family, who I barely knew, clearly had the kind of deep connections that came from growing up together and staying connected through all of life's transitions. I had spent 22 years serving my country, protecting people like them so they could live freely and safely and build the kinds of lives they wanted. It was important work, meaningful work, work that had given my life purpose and direction. But somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten that I deserved to have the same things I was working to protect for others. I deserved love and connection and the sense of belonging that came from being truly known and valued by people who mattered. The band transitioned to a faster song, and the dance floor filled with younger guests showing off moves that made me feel ancient despite being only in my late 30s. I watched my cousin Lisa dance with her boyfriend, a lawyer she'd been dating for 2 years, and who would probably propose soon based on the way her mother kept glancing, hopefully in their direction. They looked happy together, comfortable and playful and genuinely fond of each other in the way that suggested their relationship was built on friendship as much as attraction. When was the last time I'd felt that kind of easy companionship with anyone? When had I last had someone in my life who knew my quirks and preferences and could make me laugh without trying too hard? The answer was depressing enough that I didn't want to examine it too closely. The evening was beginning to wind down, though the celebration would continue for several more hours. Older guests were starting to make their polite exits, thanking the bride and groom and complimenting the parents on a lovely event. Children were getting cranky despite the excitement, and their parents were beginning to eye the door with the kind of desperation that comes from trying to maintain family harmony past bedtime. I considered leaving early myself. I'd done my duty as Tommy's sister, attended the ceremony and reception, smiled for the official photographs, and made polite conversation with the other guests at my table. Nobody would fault me for slipping away before the party moved into its later phases, when the music would get louder and the dancing more enthusiastic, and the conversations more uninhibited. But something kept me in my seat, some stubborn refusal to give up on the evening entirely. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was hope that something might happen to change the trajectory of the night. Whatever it was, I ordered another glass of wine and settled in to watch the celebration continue around me, feeling like an observer at my own family's most important gathering, but unable to find a way to become a true participant. What I didn't know as I sat there nursing my wine and contemplating the gaps in my personal life was that the evening was about to take a turn that would change everything I thought I understood about my place in my family and my value as both a sister and a soldier. But that revelation was still hours away, and for now I could only sit and wait and wonder how I'd ended up feeling so alone in a room full of people who were supposed to love me most. The cake-cutting ceremony drew everyone's attention to the front of the ballroom, where Tommy and Sarah posed beside their elaborate five-tier creation, while the photographer captured every angle of their shared moment. I watched from my peripheral position at table 12 as they performed the traditional ritual of feeding each other small bites, Sarah laughing as Tommy deliberately got frosting on her nose, both of them glowing with the kind of uninhibited joy that made everyone else smile involuntarily. After the obligatory applause and the distribution of cake slices that were almost too beautiful to eat, the evening settled into a more relaxed rhythm. The band shifted to playing background music that encouraged conversation rather than dancing, and guests moved more freely between tables, renewing old friendships and making new connections. This was the part of wedding receptions that I typically enjoyed most, the informal mingling that happened after the formal elements were complete, and people could simply be themselves. Tonight, however, the casual socializing only emphasized my outsider status. I watched as relatives and family friends gravitated toward each other with the natural ease that comes from shared history and ongoing relationships. Conversations picked up mid-thought, as if continuing discussions that had been interrupted only briefly rather than resuming after months or years of separation. Inside jokes were referenced and understood without explanation, creating circles of intimacy that I could observe but not truly join. My Aunt Helen approached my table during one of these informal interludes, wine glass in hand and a slightly flushed complexion that suggested she'd been enjoying the open bar. At 62, she was still an attractive woman, though her once dark hair had gone completely silver and lines of worry had deepened around her eyes since her husband's heart surgery 2 years ago. "Rachele, honey, you look absolutely stunning tonight," she said, settling into the empty chair beside me that Derek had vacated when he and Jennifer went to get more drinks. "That dress is gorgeous on you." "Very sophisticated." I accepted the compliment with what I hoped was gracious appreciation, though something in her tone suggested that my appearance was somehow surprising rather than simply flattering. "Thank you, Aunt Helen. You look beautiful yourself." "That color is perfect on you." She smoothed the fabric of her burgundy dress and smiled with the pleased vanity of a woman who had put considerable effort into looking her best. I wasn't sure what to wear to a country club wedding. It's been ages since Robert and I attended anything this fancy. But Sarah's family certainly knows how to put on an event, don't they? There was something in her voice that I couldn't quite identify, a subtle undercurrent that might have been admiration, or might have been something less generous. "It's a beautiful celebration," I agreed carefully. "Tommy seems incredibly happy." "Oh, he absolutely is. And Sarah is such a sweet girl, though I have to admit I was a little surprised when they got engaged. I mean, she's lovely, of course, but her family is so." She paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Well, they're very different from us, aren't they?" I studied her face, trying to understand what she was really saying. "Different how?" Helen glanced around to make sure we couldn't be overheard, then leaned closer with the conspiratorial air of someone about to share sensitive information. "Oh, you know, the country club membership, the private schools, all those connections. Sarah's father owns 3 different businesses, did you know that? And her mother chairs half the charity boards in Richmond. They're not just well off, they're what my mother would have called established society." The implications of her observation began to crystallize as I considered the evening from this new perspective. The elaborate venue, the extensive guest list, the obvious expense of every detail from the flowers to the wine selection, all of it spoke to a level of wealth and social status that my own family had never possessed. We'd been solidly middle class throughout my childhood, comfortable but not extravagant, careful with money but never truly wanting for anything important. But somewhere along the way, Tommy had crossed over into this world of country clubs and charity galas and social expectations that came with a completely different set of rules and priorities. His job at the bank had apparently been more successful than I'd realized. Or perhaps Sarah's connections had opened doors that would have remained closed to someone from our background. "I suppose Tommy's been doing very well at the bank," I said, still trying to piece together the social dynamics I'd been oblivious to. Helen nodded, though her expression remained troubled. "Oh yes, he's been promoted several times in the last few years. Assistant vice president now, I think. And of course, once he started dating Sarah, he began getting invited to all sorts of events and meeting the kind of people who can really help a career along. Not that there's anything wrong with that, she added quickly. It's smart to make those connections when you have the opportunity. But there was something in her tone that suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with the transformation she was describing. Your mother mentioned that they've bought a house in Windsor Farms, she continued. That's one of the most expensive neighborhoods in Richmond, you know. Beautiful old homes, very exclusive. I drove by it last month when I was in town, and I have to say, it's quite impressive. Windsor Farms. I'd heard of the neighborhood, of course, though I'd never had occasion to visit it. From what I knew, it was indeed one of Richmond's most prestigious addresses, the kind of place where old Virginia families lived alongside successful professionals and entrepreneurs who could afford the hefty price tags that came with historical significance and prime location. The revelation added another layer to my growing understanding of how much Tommy's life had changed in the years I'd been focused on my military career. He hadn't just fallen in love and gotten engaged. He'd essentially moved into an entirely different social stratum, one that came with expectations and obligations and ways of being that were foreign to the family we'd grown up in. I'm happy for him, I said, and meant it, though I was also beginning to understand why tonight felt so alienating. He deserves success and happiness. Of course he does, Helen agreed quickly, and Sarah seems to genuinely care about him, which is what really matters. It's just that sometimes I wonder if he feels comfortable in that world, or if he's having to pretend to be someone he's not in order to fit in. The observation struck closer to home than I wanted to admit. Wasn't that exactly what I'd been doing all evening, pretending to be comfortable with a social situation that felt completely foreign to my experience and temperament? The difference was that Tommy seemed to have successfully made the transition, while I was still struggling to find my footing. Maybe he's just grown into it naturally, I suggested. People change as they get older and their circumstances evolve. Helen considered this, swirling the wine in her glass thoughtfully. Maybe. Though I have to say, when I talked to him earlier during the cocktail hour, he seemed a little tense. Not unhappy, exactly, but like he was working very hard to make sure everything was perfect. That's not really like the Tommy I remember. Her words resonated with something I'd noticed during the ceremony and reception, but hadn't fully processed until now. Tommy had indeed seemed slightly on edge beneath his obvious happiness, hyper-aware of details and protocols, in a way that suggested he was operating in an environment where mistakes had consequences he couldn't afford. During the receiving line, I'd watched him greet Sarah's relatives and family friends with the kind of careful attention that spoke to genuine effort to make good impressions. He'd remembered names and asked about specific family members and business ventures, demonstrating the kind of social intelligence that successful people cultivate when they're navigating circles where personal and professional relationships overlap. It was admirable, actually, the way he'd clearly worked to understand and adapt to Sarah's world. But it also suggested a level of performance that must have been exhausting to maintain, especially on a day when the stakes felt particularly high. Marriage is a big adjustment, I said diplomatically. Combining two different families and backgrounds is never simple. No, it certainly isn't, Helen agreed. Though I suppose you'd know something about adapting to new environments, given your military experience. You've always been good at fitting in wherever you were sent. The comment was meant as a compliment, but it highlighted something I'd been avoiding thinking about all evening. Had I become so accustomed to adapting to new situations and environments that I'd lost touch with my authentic self? Military life required a certain amount of flexibility and the ability to function effectively in constantly changing circumstances, skills I'd developed over 2 decades of service. But maybe that adaptability had come at the cost of maintaining deeper connections to the people and places that had shaped my fundamental identity. Maybe I'd become so good at being whoever I needed to be in any given professional situation that I'd forgotten how to simply be myself in personal relationships. The band announced that they'd be taking a short break, and several guests took the opportunity to step outside onto the terrace for fresh air and quieter conversation. I excused myself from Helen and made my way through the French doors that led to the outdoor space, grateful for the cool October air and the relative peace of the garden setting. The terrace overlooked the country club's golf course, which was beautifully lit by strategically placed landscape lighting that highlighted the rolling hills and mature trees. A few other guests had had the same idea. clustering in small groups and speaking in the lowered voices that evening air seems to encourage. I found a spot near the stone railing and took a deep breath, letting the night breeze clear my head of wine and complicated family dynamics. This was when I noticed them, standing in a circle near the far end of the terrace, their voices carrying just enough for me to catch fragments of conversation. My parents were there, along with Sarah's parents and what appeared to be several other couples from their generation. They were engaged in the kind of animated discussion that suggested they were covering important ground, though they were being careful to keep their voices discreet. I couldn't hear everything they were saying, but certain words and phrases drifted across the terrace with uncomfortable clarity. "Military lifestyle," I heard my mother say, followed by Sarah's mother's response about settling down and stability. Someone mentioned grandchildren and biological clock, phrases that made my stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. They were talking about me. Specifically, they were discussing my single status and my career choices, and probably speculating about my future in ways that made me feel like a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be celebrated. The realization shouldn't have been surprising, given the subtle comments I'd been receiving all evening, but hearing it confirmed so directly was still painful. I moved closer, using a large planter as cover while I tried to catch more of their conversation. It felt underhanded and juvenile, but I needed to understand what my family really thought about my life and choices when they believed I wasn't listening. "She's almost 40, I heard my father say, his voice carrying the particular note of worry that parents use when discussing adult children who aren't living up to expectations. "At some point, she's going to have to decide what she really wants." "The military has been her whole life," Sarah's father replied, and I could hear the implied criticism in his tone. "Some people find it hard to imagine anything else." My mother's voice was barely audible, but I caught enough to understand that she was defending me while simultaneously expressing her own concerns about my future. "She's accomplished so much," she said, "but I do worry that she's missing out on the things that bring real happiness." The conversation continued in this vein for several more minutes, with various participants offering opinions about my career, my relationships, and my apparent inability to build the kind of conventional life that they all considered normal and desirable. They meant well, I knew that. These were people who loved me and wanted me to be happy according to their own definitions of happiness. But listening to them discuss my life as if it were a problem to be diagnosed and solved was profoundly demoralizing. They saw my military service as something I did, rather than something I was. A career choice that could be changed like any other, rather than a fundamental aspect of my identity and purpose. They couldn't understand that the work I did wasn't just about earning a living, but about contributing to something larger than myself, and using my skills and talents in ways that made a genuine difference in the world. More importantly, they couldn't see that the life I'd built, while different from theirs, was authentically mine. I hadn't stumbled into military service by accident or chosen it as a default option because I couldn't figure out what else to do with my life. I'd made deliberate decisions based on my values and interests and abilities, and those decisions had led me to experiences and relationships and accomplishments that I valued deeply. Yes, there had been sacrifices. Yes, there had been moments of loneliness and isolation and doubt about the path I'd chosen. But there had also been profound satisfaction in leading soldiers through difficult missions, in developing expertise that contributed to national security, in proving that women could excel in roles that had traditionally been reserved for men. The problem wasn't that my life was lacking or incomplete. The problem was that my family couldn't see its value because it didn't fit their template for what a successful woman's life should look like. And because I'd spent so much time away from them, I'd never been able to help them understand the meaning and significance of the work I did or the person I'd become through doing it. As I stood there in the shadows, listening to people who loved me discuss my life as if it were a series of mistakes that needed to be corrected, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, exactly, though there was certainly some of that. But something more like resolution. A quiet determination that I needed to find a way to bridge the gap between who I really was and who my family thought I should be. I couldn't change their fundamental values or expectations, and I wouldn't want to even if I could. But I could find ways to help them understand my choices and see the value in the life I'd built, even if it looked different from what they'd envisioned for me. I could also work harder to stay connected to them as a person rather than just as a family obligation. To be present for the everyday moments that build real relationships, rather than just showing up for major events and expecting to fit seamlessly back into dynamics I'd been absent from for months or years. The band was returning from their break, and guests were beginning to drift back inside for the final hours of the reception. I lingered on the terrace for a few more minutes, using the time to process what I'd heard and to steel myself for whatever the rest of the evening might bring. Tomorrow I would return to my regular life and responsibilities, but tonight I was committed to finding a way to connect with my family more authentically, to show them something of who I really was beneath the uniform and the professional competence they seemed to find so intimidating. What I didn't know, as I prepared to rejoin the celebration with renewed determination to bridge the gaps that had grown between us, was that the evening was about to present me with an opportunity to demonstrate my value and importance in ways that none of us could have anticipated. The next few hours would change everything about how my family saw me and how I saw my place in their lives, though that transformation was still unfolding in ways I couldn't yet imagine. The final hour of the reception was winding down with the gentle exhaustion that follows any major celebration. Children had been collected by tired parents, older relatives had made their gracious departures, and the remaining guests had settled into that comfortable phase where conversation flows more freely and formality gives way to genuine warmth. I'd returned to my table after my revelations on the terrace, determined to make the most of what remained of the evening. Derek and Jennifer had rejoined me, both slightly flushed from dancing and animated by the kind of good humor that comes from successful social events. We'd fallen into an easy conversation about travel, comparing stories from Jennifer's business trips to various tech conferences, with some of my more mundane military assignments, to places that didn't involve combat zones. It was pleasant and undemanding, the kind of small talk that fills time without requiring emotional investment. The Petersons had decided to call it an evening, and were gathering their belongings with the careful deliberation of people in their 70s, who knew better than to rush after several hours of wine and rich food. Mrs. Peterson paused to compliment my dress and to mention that their grandson was also in the military, stationed at a naval base in Virginia Beach. We exchanged a few polite comments about the challenges of military life before they made their final goodbyes. I was actually beginning to feel more relaxed, as if the conversation on the terrace had somehow released the tension that had been building throughout the evening. Perhaps it was simply knowing where I stood in my family's estimation, understanding the source of the discomfort I'd been feeling all night. Or perhaps it was my resolution to work harder at bridging the gaps between us, the sense of purpose that came from having identified a problem and committed to solving it. The band was playing softer music now, romantic standards that encouraged the remaining couples to dance closely while creating a pleasant backdrop for conversation. Tommy and Sarah were still on the dance floor, moving together with the easy intimacy of newlyweds who weren't ready for their perfect day to end. They looked tired but blissful, and I felt a genuine surge of happiness for them that had nothing to do with my own complicated feelings about the evening. That's when I first noticed the commotion near the main entrance to the ballroom. A subtle shift in the energy of the room, voices raised just enough to suggest something unexpected was happening. Several guests had turned toward the doorway, their expressions shifting from mild curiosity to something approaching awe. I followed their gazes and felt my breath catch in my throat. Standing in the entrance, scanning the room with the kind of commanding presence that automatically draws attention, was a tall man in full military dress uniform. Not just any uniform, but the distinctive blue and gold of an army general, complete with ribbons and insignia that spoke of decades of distinguished service. He was older, probably in his mid-60s, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that comes from spending a lifetime in positions of authority. Behind him stood two other officers in dress uniforms, both bearing the insignia of colonels. One was a woman about my own age, with auburn hair pulled back in a perfect military bun. The other, a man perhaps 10 years older, with the weathered complexion of someone who'd spent considerable time in challenging climates. They flanked the general with the practiced precision of experienced aides, alert but respectful, clearly accustomed to accompanying high-ranking officials to civilian events. The general's eyes moved methodically across the room, clearly searching for someone specific. When his gaze didn't immediately locate what he was looking for, I saw him lean slightly toward the female colonel, who whispered something in his ear. His expression remained neutral, but there was something in his posture that suggested urgency beneath the military courtesy. The room had gradually grown quieter as more guests noticed the new arrivals. This wasn't the kind of thing that typically happened at country club weddings, even elaborate ones like Tommy and Sarah's. Military officers didn't usually show up unannounced at civilian celebrations, especially not generals in full-dress uniform accompanied by their staff. I watched as the general approached one of the venue coordinators, a young man in a black suit who had been managing various logistical details throughout the evening. They spoke briefly, the coordinator nodding and gesturing toward different areas of the ballroom. Then the general was moving again, his staff following at a respectful distance, clearly on a mission to locate someone specific. My heart began to beat faster as I realized the implications of what I was witnessing. This wasn't a social visit or a courtesy call. This was official business of some kind, important enough to warrant the personal attention of a general and formal enough to require dress uniforms. Someone at this wedding was about to receive news that was significant enough to justify this level of military protocol. The general's search brought him closer to my section of the ballroom, and I found myself straightening in my chair, some ingrained military instinct responding to the presence of superior rank, even though I was technically off-duty and in civilian clothes. Derek and Jennifer had noticed my change in posture and were looking back and forth between me and the approaching military delegation with expressions of growing confusion. That's when the general's eyes found mine across the room, and I saw recognition flash across his features. He changed direction immediately, moving toward my table with the kind of purposeful stride that indicated he'd found what he was looking for. Behind him, his two aides maintained their formation, professional and alert. I stood automatically as he approached, military courtesy overriding civilian social conventions. Derek and Jennifer rose as well, though they clearly had no idea what was happening or how they should respond to the sudden arrival of high-ranking military officials at their table. "Colonel Matthews," the general said as he reached me, his voice carrying the kind of authority that commanded attention throughout the immediate area. Several nearby tables turned to watch the interaction, sensing that something significant was unfolding. "General," I replied, hoping my voice sounded steadier than I felt. I didn't recognize him immediately, though something about his bearing and the ribbons on his chest suggested we might have crossed paths in some official capacity. "General William Harrison," he said, extending his hand in a firm handshake. "4th Infantry Division. I believe we met briefly at the Pentagon last spring during the Joint Operations Briefing." The memory clicked into place. General Harrison had been one of several senior officers reviewing a strategic assessment that my unit had contributed to, though we'd had only the briefest of interactions during the formal presentation. I was surprised he remembered me at all, much less well enough to recognize me out of uniform at a civilian event. "Yes, sir," I said, still trying to understand why he was here and how he'd known to find me. "I remember." By now, the conversation at nearby tables had stopped entirely as other wedding guests realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Tommy and Sarah had noticed the commotion and were making their way off the dance floor, their expressions shifting from curiosity to concern as they saw military officers clustered around their reception. General Harrison seemed oblivious to the attention we were drawing, his focus entirely on the business at hand. "Colonel Matthews, I need to speak with you immediately about a developing situation in the Eastern Mediterranean. We have a crisis that requires your specific expertise, and frankly, you're the only officer available who has both the language skills and the regional experience we need." The words hit me like a physical blow. A crisis situation requiring my immediate involvement, serious enough to send a general to track me down at a family wedding. This wasn't a routine consultation or a request for written input. This was an all-hands-on-deck emergency that had prompted the Army to locate me during my personal time and deploy senior officers to retrieve me. "Sir," I began, acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes now focused on our conversation, "I'm currently on approved leave for a family event." "I understand that, Colonel, and I wouldn't be here if we had any alternative." The situation developed within the last 6 hours, and we need someone with your qualifications briefed and deployed within 12 hours. The Secretary of Defense has personally authorized me to recall you to active duty status effective immediately. The formal language sent a chill down my spine. When the Secretary of Defense gets personally involved in recalling individual officers, the situation is beyond serious. It's the kind of crisis that could have international implications, the kind that requires the very best people available regardless of their current assignments or personal circumstances. Around us, the wedding reception had essentially stopped. The band was still playing, but no one was dancing anymore. Conversations had died as guests strained to hear what was happening at table 12, where a general was apparently commandeering one of their fellow guests for some kind of military emergency. I was vaguely aware of my family members pushing through the crowd of onlookers. My parents appeared first, their faces pale with shock and concern. Tommy and Sarah were right behind them, still in their wedding attire, but looking completely bewildered by the sudden transformation of their celebration into what appeared to be a military briefing. "Rachele," my mother said, her voice tight with worry, "what's happening? Who are these people?" Before I could respond, General Harrison turned toward her with the kind of courteous professionalism that senior military officers master when dealing with civilian family members during crisis situations. "Ma'am, I'm General Harrison with the United States Army. Your daughter is one of our most valuable officers, and we have an urgent situation that requires her immediate expertise. I'm afraid I need to ask her to return to duty status tonight." My father stepped forward, and I could see him struggling to process what he was hearing. "Tonight? But this is my son's wedding. Rachele is on leave. Surely this can wait until Monday." The general's expression remained respectful but firm. "I'm afraid not, sir. The situation we're facing has the potential to destabilize an entire region, if not handled properly, and Colonel Matthews has unique qualifications that make her essential to our response. I wouldn't be here if we had any other options." The weight of his words settled over the assembled group like a heavy blanket. This wasn't about paperwork or routine military business. This was about preventing some kind of international crisis, the kind of situation that makes headlines and changes the course of history. Tommy spoke up for the first time, his voice strained with confusion and what might have been hurt. "I don't understand. What makes Rachele so important? What does she do that's so critical?" General Harrison looked at me briefly, as if asking permission to explain, then turned back to address my family directly. "Your sister is one of the Army's leading experts on Middle Eastern affairs and counterterrorism operations. She's fluent in 3 Arabic dialects and has extensive experience working with international coalition forces. More importantly, she's one of only a handful of officers who have successfully navigated the specific political and cultural challenges we're currently facing." The silence that followed his explanation was profound. I watched as my family members processed this information, their faces reflecting a mixture of surprise, pride, and dawning understanding. These were aspects of my military service that I'd never discussed in detail, partly because they were often classified and partly because I'd never found a way to explain their significance to people who had no frame of reference for the complexities of modern military operations. Sarah's father, who had been standing at the edge of the group, stepped forward with the kind of respectful attention that successful businessmen show when they recognize they're in the presence of someone operating at a level they hadn't previously understood. "General," he said, "I'm curious about something. When you arrived here tonight, how did you know where to find Colonel Matthews? This is a private event at a civilian venue." General Harrison's slight smile suggested he'd been expecting the question. "The Army knows where all of its key personnel are at all times, sir. When the situation developed this afternoon, we immediately began locating our available experts. Colonel Matthews was one of the first names on our list, and our personnel office confirmed she was attending a family wedding in Richmond. From there, it was simply a matter of determining the specific venue." The implications of his explanation began to sink in around the group. The Army had not only known exactly where I was on my personal time, but had considered me important enough to send a general with a full staff to retrieve me personally. This wasn't how the military typically handles routine personnel matters. My mother looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something that combined maternal worry with what might have been awe. "Rachele, I had no idea. You never told us that your work was so important," my father finished, his voice carrying a note of wonder that made my chest tight with emotion. "We knew you were successful, but we didn't realize you were." He trailed off, seeming to search for the right words. "Essential," General Harrison supplied quietly. "Colonel Matthews is one of our most valuable assets. Her expertise has been crucial to several major operations over the past 5 years, and her insights have literally helped prevent international incidents that could have cost thousands of lives." The wedding guests who had gathered around our impromptu military briefing were now staring at me with expressions of shock and newfound respect. These people, who had known me only as Tommy's sister, the family member who lived far away and worked some vague military job, were suddenly seeing me in an entirely different light. I felt Derek's hand on my shoulder and realized that my college friend was looking at me with something approaching reverence. "Ray," he said quietly, "I had no idea. All these years, I just thought you were a regular officer." "There are no regular officers," General Harrison said, overhearing the comment. "But Colonel Matthews operates at a level that most people never see. The work she does happens in classified briefing rooms and secure communication channels, which is why most civilians have no understanding of its significance." Tommy stepped closer to me, his wedding suit making him look young and uncertain in the presence of so much military authority. "Sis," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "why didn't you ever tell us? Why didn't we know how important your job was?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with years of misunderstanding and missed opportunities for connection. How could I explain that I'd tried, in small ways, to help them understand the significance of my work? That I'd been discouraged by their polite but uncomprehending responses, their tendency to change the subject when I mentioned deployments or operations or the complexities of international relations? But this wasn't the time for lengthy explanations or family therapy. General Harrison was checking his watch with the kind of subtle impatience that indicated we were working against a tight timeline. "Colonel Matthews," he said, "I'm afraid we need to move. The briefing is scheduled for 0600 hours, and we have a long flight ahead of us." The reality of the situation hit me fully for the first time. I was going to have to leave. Right now, in the middle of Tommy's wedding reception, while wearing a cocktail dress and heels, I was going to walk out of this ballroom with a general and 2 colonels and disappear into whatever crisis was unfolding half a world away. "Of course, sir," I said, my military training overriding my personal feelings. "I just need a moment to change clothes and collect my things from the hotel." "We have a full kit waiting in the vehicle," the female colonel spoke for the first time, her voice crisp and professional, "including appropriate uniforms and equipment. We can't afford the time for you to return to your hotel." Sarah suddenly stepped forward, her wedding dress rustling as she moved quickly across the space between us. "Wait," she said, her voice carrying a note of distress that made everyone turn toward her. "This is our wedding day. Our family is here, Rachele's family is here. Can't this wait just a few more hours? Can't someone else handle whatever this is?" General Harrison's expression softened slightly as he looked at the young bride, clearly recognizing the emotional impact of what was happening. "Ma'am, I understand how difficult this is, and I'm deeply sorry for the disruption to your celebration. If there were any other way to handle this situation, we would take it. But Colonel Matthews possesses a unique combination of skills and experience that make her irreplaceable in this particular crisis." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "I can tell you that the work she'll be doing in the next 48 hours could prevent a conflict that would otherwise involve thousands of American service members. Her expertise could literally save lives and prevent a situation that would dominate international headlines for months." The gravity of his explanation settled over the group like a physical weight. This wasn't about bureaucracy or military politics. This was about preventing war, about using diplomatic and strategic expertise to defuse a situation before it exploded into something much larger and more devastating. I looked at Tommy and Sarah, seeing the disappointment and confusion in their faces, but also the beginning of understanding. They were starting to grasp that my sudden departure wasn't about choosing work over family, but but about accepting responsibility for something larger than personal preferences or social obligations. "Tommy," I said, stepping toward my brother and taking his hands in mine. "I'm so sorry. This isn't how I wanted your wedding day to end." He squeezed my hands tightly, and I could see tears beginning to form in his eyes. "I'm proud of you, sis. I always have been. But I didn't really understand what I was proud of until tonight." Sarah moved to stand beside her new husband, her own eyes bright with unshed tears but her expression resolute. "Go," she said quietly. "Do whatever you need to do. Our marriage will still be here when you get back." I hugged them both, trying to memorize the feeling of being surrounded by family love and support in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Around us, the wedding guests watched in respectful silence, witnessing something they would probably talk about for years to come. My parents approached for their own farewells, and I could see a transformation in their faces that would stay with me long after this night was over. They were looking at me not as their wayward daughter who had chosen career over conventional happiness, but as someone whose work mattered in ways they were only beginning to understand. "Come home safe, my mother," whispered, as she hugged me tightly. "And come home soon." "We'll be here," my father added, his voice thick with emotion. "Whatever you need when you get back, we'll be here." As I walked toward the ballroom exit with General Harrison and his staff, I turned back once to see my family standing together in the middle of the reception area, still in their wedding finery, but forever changed by what they had witnessed. The evening that had begun with me feeling like an outsider to my own family was ending with them finally understanding who I really was and what my life's work actually meant. The transformation wasn't complete, and there would be much more work to do in rebuilding and strengthening our relationships when I returned from whatever mission awaited me. But something fundamental had shifted tonight, something that would change the dynamic between us forever. I didn't know yet what crisis was waiting for me in the classified briefing rooms of Washington, or how long I would be away from the family I was finally beginning to reconnect with. But I knew that I was walking out of that country club ballroom as a different person than I had been when I walked in, no longer the overlooked sister relegated to table 12, but Colonel Rachele Matthews, essential personnel whose expertise was needed to help keep the world safe. 6 months later, I stood in the same country club ballroom, but everything was different. The space had been transformed for my promotion ceremony, decorated with military colors and filled with an audience that included both my Army colleagues and my family. The contrast with Tommy's wedding couldn't have been more striking, yet somehow it felt like the perfect completion of a story that had begun with me sitting alone at table 12. The mission that had pulled me away from the reception had lasted 3 weeks and involved delicate negotiations with coalition partners to prevent a regional conflict that could have drawn in multiple nations. The details remained classified, but the successful resolution had earned recognition from the highest levels of government and accelerated my promotion to full colonel ahead of schedule. Today's ceremony was smaller than Tommy's wedding, but no less meaningful. My family occupied the front row, their faces glowing with pride and understanding that had been missing 6 months ago. My mother wore navy blue, the same color as my dress uniform, and my father had taken dozens of photos already, documenting every moment with the enthusiasm of someone who finally grasped the significance of what he was witnessing. Tommy and Sarah sat beside my parents, her hand resting protectively over the small bump that announced their first child was on the way. They'd visited me twice at my new posting in Virginia, making the effort to understand my world in ways they'd never attempted before. Sarah had been particularly interested in the international aspects of my work, asking intelligent questions about diplomacy and cultural relations that showed she'd been doing her own research. The ceremony itself was brief and formal, exactly as military traditions demanded. General Harrison, who had become something of a mentor since that night at the wedding, delivered remarks about leadership and service that made my chest tight with pride. When he pinned the new insignia on my uniform, symbolizing my promotion to full colonel, I felt the weight of both accomplishment and responsibility settle on my shoulders. But it was what happened afterward that truly mattered. During the reception that followed, my family didn't cluster together in their own separate group. Instead, they moved freely among my military colleagues, engaging in conversations about my work and their own lives, with the easy confidence that comes from genuine mutual respect. I watched my father deep in conversation with two of my fellow officers about leadership principles that applied equally to military units and civilian organizations. My mother was comparing notes with a colonel's wife about the challenges of maintaining family connections across long distances and frequent relocations. They were building bridges I'd never imagined possible. The most significant moment came when my Aunt Helen approached me near the end of the evening, wine glass in hand, but her eyes completely clear and focused. "Rachele," she said, "I owe you an apology. We all do, really. We spent so many years thinking you were missing out on life, when actually, you were living it more fully than any of us understood." I shook my head, not wanting this day to be about past misunderstandings. There's nothing to apologize for. We just didn't know how to talk to each other about what mattered. "Maybe," she said, "but that's changing now. After what we saw at Tommy's wedding, after learning what you really do and how important it is, we realize we need to do better. We want to do better." The conversation was interrupted by Tommy, who appeared at my elbow with the kind of broad smile that reminded me of the little boy who used to follow me around the backyard, insisting he could do anything his big sister could do. "Speech," he announced, tapping his wine glass with a fork to get everyone's attention. "I need to say something while I still have the courage." The room gradually quieted as family members and military colleagues turned toward us, sensing that something important was about to happen. Tommy cleared his throat and looked directly at me, his expression serious despite his smile. "6 months ago, at my wedding, I learned something about my sister that changed everything I thought I knew about courage and service and what it means to put others before yourself. I spent my whole life thinking I understood Rachele, but I was only seeing the surface of who she really is." He paused, gathering his thoughts, and I could see Sarah nodding encouragingly from across the room. "Tonight, we're celebrating her promotion, but really we're celebrating the fact that our country is smart enough to recognize what our family should have seen all along. Rachele isn't just my big sister who happens to be in the army. She's Colonel Matthews, someone whose expertise and dedication help keep all of us safe. Someone whose work matters on a scale most of us can't even comprehend." The room was completely silent now, everyone focused on Tommy's words and the emotion behind them. "I'm proud to be her brother," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "I'm proud that when the world needs someone who can handle impossible situations with intelligence and grace, they call my sister. And I'm grateful that she's taught our whole family something about what real service looks like." He raised his wine glass, and everyone in the room followed suit. "To Colonel Rachele Matthews, who proves every day that the most important battles aren't always the ones that make headlines, and that the greatest victories sometimes happen in rooms where the cameras never go." The toast that followed was enthusiastic and heartfelt, but what moved me most was seeing my military colleagues and my family united in genuine celebration. These two parts of my life that had been separate for so long were finally coming together in ways that felt natural and sustainable. Later that evening, as the reception was winding down, I found myself standing on the same terrace where I'd overheard my family's concerns about my life choices 6 months earlier. This time, I wasn't alone. Sarah had joined me, her wedding ring catching the light as she rested her hands on the stone railing. "I wanted to thank you," she said quietly, "for showing me what it looks like to live according to your own values instead of other people's expectations." I looked at her curiously, not sure what she meant. "Before I met you, I thought there was only one way to be successful as a woman: marriage, children, social connections, the conventional path. But watching you at our wedding, seeing how you handled that impossible situation with such professionalism and grace, made me realize there are as many ways to build a meaningful life as there are people brave enough to choose their own path." She smiled, touching her stomach gently. "Don't get me wrong, I'm thrilled about the baby and the life Tommy and I are building together. But I'm also going back to school for my master's degree in international relations. I want to understand the world you work in, maybe even find ways to contribute to it myself." The revelation shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. Sarah had always seemed content with the traditional role she'd chosen, and I'd never imagined she might be interested in the complexities of international affairs and diplomacy. "That's wonderful," I said, meaning it completely. "You'd be excellent at it. You have exactly the kind of interpersonal skills that make diplomatic work possible." As the evening came to a close and I prepared to return to my new assignment, I realized that the transformation that had begun 6 months ago was now complete, not just in how my family saw me, but in how I saw myself and my place in their lives. I was no longer the outsider trying to fit into a world that didn't understand my choices. I was Colonel Rachele Matthews, a woman whose work mattered and whose family finally understood both the sacrifices and the significance of the path I'd chosen. More importantly, I'd learned that staying connected to the people you love doesn't require compromising who you are. It just requires finding ways to help them see the value in the person you've chosen to become. The table 12 days were over. From now on, I would take my place wherever I belonged, confident in my worth, and surrounded by people who finally understood what that worth really meant. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.